Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Coordinated Assistance to States webinar on reducing the use of isolation in youth facilities, strategies, and lessons learned from the field. My name is Mike Dempsey, and I'm the Executive Director of the Council of Juvenile Correctional Administrators, also known as CJCA. I'm here with Brendan Donahue, Technology Manager for Performance-Based Standards Learning Institute, who is producing this webinar, and joining us remotely from New York City is Sharon Pett, who is the Reducing Isolation Project Manager. Before we get started, Brendan has a few housekeeping items that he'd like to present.
All right, thank you, Mike. And just to address a couple frequently asked questions, and I can see some folks are still joining the webinar here, but a couple notes for today is that you can listen to the audio in two different ways. You can listen through your computer speakers, or you can also dial in on the telephone. When people ask us questions about echo or problems with the audio, we generally recommend that they switch over to the telephone. Just make sure you've chosen the appropriate audio option on the control panel on your screen. So if you've called in on the telephone, make sure you've chosen the telephone option on your computer screen. That will greatly reduce any unwanted feedback or echo. We will be recording today's webinar, so if you want to go back and watch it again or share it with somebody else in your agency or at your facility, you're more than welcome to. We'll be able to produce a link to the video recording within about 2 days of the webinar end, and we'll send everything out by follow-up emails. That will also include a copy of today's PowerPoint presentation. So if you're looking for today's slides, we will send you a link in a follow-up email, again, usually within 2 days of the webinar ending. Now, we've got several presenters, and we've got a lot of people on the phone line, so everybody will be muted except for our presenters. Ask them questions. You can do so by typing them in on the webinar control panel. It's on your right-hand side of your screen, and towards the bottom, you'll see a place where you can ask some questions of our panelists, and you can type them in at any point during the presentation. So we'll do question and answer time at the end, but if you see a slide or you hear a note and you have a question about it, please don't wait till the end to ask your questions. Type them right here on the screen, and we'll try and address as many of them as we can at the end of today's presentation. So with that, you've got everything that you need to know from me. So Mike, tell them what we'll be doing today.
Thanks, Brendan. Again, I want to welcome all of you and thank you for joining us today. We are honored and excited to have been granted the funds to conduct the fourth and final year of the Reducing Isolation in Youth Facilities Technical and Training Assistance Initiative. Joining OJJDP as our partners in this initiative are the American Institute for Research in Washington, D.C., and the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown University. This webinar has been made possible by the Center for Coordinated Assistance to States. CCAS was developed in 2014 with a grant from the Office of Juvenile Justice and Delinquency Prevention. The purpose of the center is to assess the need for and coordinate the delivery of training and technical assistance designed to build capacity within states, territories, tribal units, and communities to maximize the effectiveness of juvenile justice systems and the benefit of the youth they serve. The focus of the center is on providing ongoing coaching, education, and resources to achieve system, individual, and/or behavioral changes that positively impact the juvenile justice system, and most importantly, to improve outcomes for youth entrusted to our care. The first objective is to increase knowledge about the impact isolation has on youth committed to secure juvenile facilities. The second is to highlight key steps to reducing or eliminating isolation in detention and correctional facilities. And finally, the third is to present real-life examples of how agencies and facilities have reduced the use of isolation. Performance-based standards defines isolation as any time a youth is physically or socially isolated for punishment or for administrative purposes. This definition intentionally excludes protective and medical isolation. At this point, we all know and recognize that research shows that placing youth in isolation has negative public safety consequences, does not reduce violence within facilities, can harm youth psychologically, physically, and developmentally, and I would add that isolation can make facilities less safe by increasing youth aggressiveness and assaultive behaviors. CJCA believes that isolating or confining a youth in his or her room should be used only to protect the youth from harming himself or herself or others, and if used, should be for the shortest period of time necessary to protect others or the youth, and should be supervised directly by a staff member. Procedures should be in place to de-escalate and resolve the issue and return the youth to normal programs as soon as possible. We want to welcome all of you again to today's webinar. I want to take a moment to recognize the teams from the 4 jurisdictions that were selected for this CCAS Reducing Isolation Training and Technical Assistance Program. Those include the Florida Department of Juvenile Justice, the Kentucky Department of Juvenile Justice, Multnomah County, Oregon Department of Community Justice, and the Virginia Department of Juvenile Justice. Also participating in Cohort 4 and receiving a modified version of the Reducing Isolation Youth Facilities TA program is the Kansas Department of Corrections Juvenile Services and the Nebraska Department of Health and Human Services Office of Juvenile Services. We also want to give our appreciation to the other jurisdictions that applied for the Reducing Isolation grant and to encourage them to continue their work and efforts on reducing isolation by participating in the national webinars, as well as engaging with other national projects working on this issue. Today's consultants and present presenters for today's webinar include Peter Forbes, Commissioner of Massachusetts Department of Youth Services, Clint McClellan, Assistant Director, Facility Services, Oregon Youth Authority, Natalie Walker, Assistant Director, Indiana Division of Youth Services, and Mark Canola, Program Director, Indiana Division of Youth Services. So with those introductions, let's begin with our first presenter, Clint from Oregon Youth Authority.
Good morning, and in some cases, good afternoon. I just want to make sure I give some context before I start this morning in my role. I've been the Assistant Director overseeing facilities, closed custody facilities in Oregon for the last 4 years. These slides were developed by our director, our past director, who has moved on to another large responsibility. He has been promoted to take over the Department of Human Services in Oregon. So you got a little bit of the JV team today, but I will do my best. I have been extremely close to the work operationally in facilities, and hopefully we can share some lessons. And the title today was Strategies and Lessons Learned from the Field, and I will say that there are many lessons learned, and we are still learning. It's very important to reiterate that this is a work in progress. We've been working 3 years on this in Oregon, and we're still learning and making slow improvements. So I'm saying that to preface that we haven't got this thing figured out yet, but we do have some good information for you. So I will go ahead and draw attention to the slide and really talk about the importance of culture. As you can see there, there are several, creating a culture in and of itself is difficult enough. You just put your values, your beliefs together, get a bunch of people, and move forward. That is if you don't already have a current culture that exists. And as you know, creating a culture is difficult enough, and countering a culture that already exists is extremely challenging. So that is something that we've been able in Oregon to really focus on, that culture development. Before we make any real changes, we have to change the mind and hearts of people. So culture is huge. And why focus on culture change? I'm on to my next slide here, sorry. Oops, okay. Why culture, why is it so important to focus on culture? One is because you can't, with a current correctional punitive culture that a lot of jurisdictions have created over many, many years of best practices, you can't just throw out a policy and hope it sticks. Some jurisdictions have been put in extremely tough places where they've had to really change overnight, so to speak. And that is a tall task, you know, coming in and being sued and then reacting and legislative changes and all of that. In Oregon, we were really lucky to be able to take the slow road and really work on educating folks and being able to develop that culture slowly. And then we're still in that process. So the culture is so important. I know I've said that several times now, but it's so important to make sure people understand the clarity of the culture before the new practices are put into place. The next slide. Sorry, I can't seem to talk and operate my slides here. Sorry, I'm working on it. I'm gonna go to the next one here. Okay. The only way culture is gonna get shifted in an organization is through the leadership. And that is obviously where it all starts. You know, you really have to understand the impetus for change. And again, I will put my slide up here, sorry. The impetus for change. So basically what I would suggest and what we've tried to do is you tie the impetus for change back to your mission statement or your why statement and make sure it's the fundamental purpose. Make sure that the reason why you're making the change ties directly in what you're trying to do and what your mission is. And that's fairly easy to do with isolation. And then this, you know, having the slow approach, again, the gradual movement from existing paradigm to where you want to go is crucial. And again, a lot of jurisdictions don't have that luxury, but if you have the opportunity, make sure your leadership understands it's going to take time and effort and a lot of it. Next, I have 5 specific roles for leaders in managing change. Okay. So, you know, there's the human case for change, right, and the business case. And in isolation, reducing isolation, there are both that are pretty easy to be had. You know, the human change, people get in this business to work with kids, right? We want to make kids better. We want to give them opportunities. We want to equip and empower kids. Making that human case is pretty easy, knowing that we can't teach kids anything when we put them in a box, right? And that long-term isolation, all the evidence that's out there on brain development, it's very, very easy to make that human case. The business case is, you know, it depends. You know, what jurisdiction and what kind of pressure you're getting. But really in Oregon, it was about trying to control our own destiny before this push of, you know, reducing isolation or eliminating isolation as a tool was going to come in and be legislated, and then we were going to be stuck with a real problem and not being able to use at all a real important tool to keep people safe, you know, for the immediate security issues that we still use isolation for, and we need it. The next slide is really about, you know, engaging the people that do the work, right, in the transformation process. You can't go away in the lab and come up with a great plan and execute it, or go in the lab and come up with a great policy. You have to get out there and get the folks that are doing the work, know the kids, know the operations, know the clinical piece, know youth development, and get them around the table to be part of creating this effort. You can't go from the top down. And again, it's one other area that takes time and effort. We were able to do that, like I said, and we probably started our first large group was probably had about 30 to 40 members, and we took several months in developing alternatives and approaches, and it's definitely paid off. And that's the only way you're going to win the hearts and minds of people and that are doing the work, is that if they are in on developing and they own and take pride in the improvements. And we got to have tools, right? You can't just take something away, right? Which is what reducing isolation and folks are going to see. You're taking away the tools for our safety. So you really have to go through that education piece, and as Mike mentioned before, improve the statistics that are there, say that isolation does not create safety, especially long-term isolation. Shutting that big door and separating the staff and the youth, it creates, a good example is a lot of jurisdictions that have long-term isolation, and a lot of it, they have a higher rate of staff assaults. Youth assaults stay about the same, but if the higher the isolation rates, the staff assaults go up. So just use those statistics to educate, create the alternatives, train for the tools. You got to give the new interventions, new approaches, DBT, emotional regulation. Try to find places other than the isolation area to re-regulate kids. We call it in-between spaces in Oregon, and really do a good job of training the third-party interventions. Next slide. And in a lot of jurisdictions, it's a challenge to collect data and have a robust ability to do that. And again, in Oregon, we're very blessed to have a lot of data at our fingertips. Even if it's spreadsheets and things like that, it's important to monitor and break down those isolation episodes, like per living unit. In Oregon, we have big facilities. We have 13 living units on one unit, to one facility. So getting one big conglomerate doesn't tell us a lot. Break those down to the individual living units and make sure the managers are owning those numbers. Make sure we celebrate any kind of success. Little successes are huge. Rewarding the good behavior and continue to engage staff in the improvement process with their innovative ideas, because that's where the real we've seen some of the biggest improvements are listening to our folks. Next slide. All right. And really, modeling the change you seek. It's all about leadership. You've got to treat people well. There's no doubt about it. We have a saying that we've created recently is that, the executive team leadership of our agency is here to support and develop our managers, to support and develop our staff, to support and develop our youth. And you can't have one of those out of place. They've all got to be in alignment. So that's what I have for you today.
Thanks, Clint, for that. And a lot of the stuff that Mark and I will be covering will echo some of what you just heard from Clint. In order to reduce isolation, like Clint talked about, we had to change the overall culture in our facilities. One of our biggest challenges was that we had a very, I'd say, adult-minded correctional division with a lot of the same policies and procedures as the adult facilities. We also had to overcome staff fear for safety, because like Clint was alluding to, staff reported that using isolation was their best or sometimes only recourse for feeling safe or accountability. So Mark and I will be discussing the ways we address and change the culture in our facilities.
So the first thing we did was focus on recruiting the right staff. And in order to change our culture, we started looking at our vision, mission, and our values and making sure that they were all focused on youth development. And then we began trying to recruit staff who were interested in working with youth and helping change the lives of kids. So to do this, it was difficult to do if we kept calling the job description correctional officer. So the first thing we did was we changed certain job titles and descriptions. So for example, we changed correctional officer to youth development specialist so that it would give a true description of what is behind that job. We also altered the job description to focus more on developing youth in a positive way. So for example, some of the expectations listed on the job bank would be that YDSs, as we call them, support treatment programs. They participate in the youth treatment. They also act as informal mentors to the youth. So a lot more language about developing the youth. There's still things in there about safety and security, but also a lot more on how they can help out in treatment. The next change we made was to amend our interview process to better achieve a right fit of potential candidates. So we added job shadowing so that potential employees can experience firsthand where they will be working and what they will be doing with our youth. So, again, to sort of fight the stereotypes of what working in a correctional environment is like, we want to bring them in and show what working with who we call our kids, working with our kids is like, as opposed to, say, coming in to work with quote-unquote offenders. Superintendents also meet with each job candidate prior to offering employment to discuss our mission and to emphasize our focus on youth development. So once we revamped some of the job titles and the job descriptions, we then realized we had to revamp our training to fit this new youth-focused mission. Although in revamping it, juvenile staff still attend the same new employee training as adult staff for the first 4 weeks of their employment. However, during that training, there is now an adult trainer and a juvenile trainer co-facilitating during those first 4 weeks. The training is mostly on general DOC policies, procedures, and correctional concepts. And the trainers and employees all stay together to learn those things that are the same or similar on the adult and juvenile side of Indiana DOC. However, when these areas differ, the juvenile staff and the juvenile trainers go into their own breakout sessions. And there they focus on the juvenile version of the policy or procedure, the juvenile correctional concepts, and juvenile-oriented scenarios and examples. Also, to the juvenile training, they go a full extra week of juvenile-specific training called Making a Change, or what's called the MAC Academy for short. This training focuses on understanding adolescent development and working effectively with youth who are at each stage of development in our facilities. We also added trauma-informed care in order to help staff understand the underlying issues that may result in certain youth behaviors in our facilities. We also added motivational interviewing and conflict resolution training, which both help staff learn new ways to talk to the youth, motivate the youth, as well as de-escalate and refocus the youth. And this way we give them lots and lots of skills right off the bat that can help them work with youth and not have to use isolation when a youth escalates in their behavior. Also, it adds a lot more, encourages staff to use a lot more positive engagement of youth and how to do that so that their relationship with the youth is not just holding them accountable. It's both, and it's back to that idea of developing them as youth. So we put a lot of those skills into those two trainings. We also developed something even more complex than that. It starts with MAC Academy, but we also run it at our receiving facilities ongoing. Is the Joint Understanding and Cooperation Program, or JUCP. And this program, the focus of it is to show students how staff think inside a facility, but also to show staff how students view their time in a facility. At first, it's about a 3-day training session. In the first couple of days, staff and students receive separate training so they can focus on the importance of role modeling and redirecting behaviors, as well as understanding where the other side's coming from. So there's 2 days of that. And then in the final day, they come together and discuss how they can reinforce each other's positive behaviors and keep each other's perspectives in mind. And I think another excellent use of this program is the Joint Understanding and Cooperation Program. Youth who go through it as a member also can then be trained to deliver the program. So this program is also delivered by correctional, the YDSs, and by our youth together, so that the members joining the program can see staff and students already working together in a cooperative way.
Another part of the developing of culture was to utilize data to drive our practices. We incorporate performance-based standards, or PBS, into the foundation and culture of our facilities to the point that it has become the way of our doing business. We share data with all of our staff, which has helped them understand the reasons behind changes we made and continue to make. It comes back to that discussion about accountability and safety. So we had to share the information about, you know, assault and about isolation and those kind of things and the impact they were having on our youth and staff. Being able to see what they were above the national average for isolation use, and especially for duration of isolation, was very impactful for staff. Our staff could now see how others significantly reduced the use of isolation without increasing incidents or risking safety. This data helped us start the conversation of why can't we do the same? It eventually reduced the fear, and that reducing isolation would increase risk to staff. Our superintendents also, we asked them to work different hours so that they can meet with small groups of staff on all shifts. They show them all the PBS reports, they ask for their ideas on making changes or improvements, and then those staff can directly participate in developing and meeting our facility improvement plans. We also conduct daily incident monitoring meetings. Department heads come together and discuss all the incidents that occurred the 24 hours prior to the monitor meeting. The use of isolation, anything from the day before. They review those incidents, making sure that all of our processes were in place. So we talk about utilizing motivational interviewing, maybe some JUCP techniques. Those kind of things come up as far as a discussion with our staff on how we could have handled that situation maybe in a different way. That makes staff make sure that they made every effort to de-escalate and keep that youth out of isolation. These meetings have given staff the ability to discuss reasons why they might be aware of the youth behaviors or actions. So maybe some occurrence happened with a counselor or another YDS, or maybe they were having something going on with their family that they knew about the situation, and then they could share it with the whole team and can work together on a plan to help out that youth. We also focus on PBS data monthly, not just during the data reporting months. We have a PBS facility report that each facility submits monthly with all of our PBS outcome measures on it. This way we can celebrate successes on a regular basis, especially in decreasing isolation or addressing problem areas quickly. Because we are constantly measuring and reporting, PBS has also helped us recognize what is working. For example, for PBS standard 08, order 08, we were able to decrease our frequency and the number of isolation uses. From April of 2009 to October 2017, we had one site that saw an 86% reduction in the use of isolation. Overall, with our division, there's been a 29% reduction. In PBS standard order 09, which is the average duration of isolation, room confinement, and segregation, we were able to decrease from 25 hours in April 2009 to 2.85 hours in October of 2018. That's an 86% decrease. 91.5% of our isolations are terminated within 4 hours, and 92.53% of our isolations are terminated within 8 hours. So currently, the field average was 15.39 hours, while we are at 2.5 hours, which puts us at 81.2% below the field average. This data shows us that things that we have implemented are working. We've also, in inclusion with data, started engaging our families to help reduce isolation. In the past, a lot of the correctional mindset was to keep the families out and address the youth behaviors and issues internally and not include the family. There's been a complete cultural and mind shift change that the families need to be included because, again, these kids are going to be going out to those families when they return. So one of our first steps, we used to have the visitation. Visitation was only offered on a specific day of the week, or we limited the times of the day for when these families could come and visit their youth in our facilities. We've opened that up and allow multiple visitation days and hours and allow visits to occur daily and at any time that is convenient for the families. We implemented conference calls with families to discuss reasons for isolation. For example, if we have a youth that is placed in isolation, we contact the family, we do a family session over the phone. In this way, the youth can discuss their behaviors with their families. The staff can also talk with the family, and all of them together can collaborate on strategies to help the youth make better decisions in the future. We also increase collaborative family sessions with facility counselors and juvenile reintegration specialists, which are our juvenile parole staff. Counselors also contact families each time a youth is reviewed by treatment team. so that they can participate and be part of an ongoing treatment intervention. We also created several different family events at each facility. One facility offers family days, and where the families can eat and participate in fun activities with their students. All of our facilities are offering tours to the family, which are given by facility executive staff. We have frequently parent-teacher conferences in education and graduation celebrations that include the youth wearing a cap and gown. We have at one facility family tie session in which mental health staff, facility counselors, and even the youth themselves will teach families the skills that the students are learning in their treatment groups. Families can also attend volunteer activities with the youth. We are constantly trying to brainstorm and elicit family and student ideas to add new and exciting things to increase our family participation. So Mark will now continue with the next section.
To commit to culture change, we also implemented some other practices. The first one is we operate living units from a unit team concept. And what that means is that treatment staff and the youth development specialists work very closely together, especially when it comes to treatment interventions for the youth on the living units, and also in participating in treatment review teams for each youth, so that the youth begin to see both the YDSs and the treatment staff as people working to help them improve, and that the teams work together with that goal in mind, and that's what they communicate to the youth. So it's not just holding you accountable, it's keeping you safe, it's keeping you secure, it's holding you accountable, but it's also helping you grow as a youth and meet your goals and the goals of your community. We also operate using a conflict resolution approach between youth and staff, and that can happen in many different ways. So, all of our staff are trained to do conflict resolution between two youth. So a YDS on a unit can have a conflict resolution session, pull two youth aside and have them talk it out. But if it happens between youth and staff, we've also implemented staff mentors at each facility. And the mentors can be everyone from youth development specialists to treatment staff to admin staff. And the mentors can come in and do mediation between two youths in conflict, or between a youth and a staff member in conflict. And the mediator's goal is to resolve things without resorting to any kind of isolation and to help de-escalate the youth. A lot of times, just doing a kind of announcing that we're going to do a conflict resolution works, and the youth will return quickly to normal activities. And then we also have our mentors track their activities with the youth each week. They meet regularly with the youth so that to develop a rapport and then report that out to treatment. Another thing we use is a bit more formal than informal conflict resolution. We also started using a care team, and the care team are now our first responders to an incident. Instead of a quick response team, or what we call a QRT, who are trained to resolve with force, the care team will come when something's going on to try to de-escalate the situation first instead of using force. And so the care team stands for Crisis Awareness Response Effort Team, and they are all specially trained staff who are trained to respond to a youth in crisis or a youth in conflict and resolve it using de-escalation techniques. So for example, if a line staff is having trouble de-escalating a youth, they can just get on the radio and call for a care team. A care team who is scheduled and designated will report to where that youth is at, and they will help de-escalate the situation. A lot of times they will pull the youth into an office or an area that's not being used to get them away from the living unit or the situation at the time. And that way the youth isn't performing for anybody or doesn't feel embarrassed by having care team called or escalating them further. Once they take the youth aside, they can de-escalate them right then and there. If they talk things out and the youth comes up with a plan with care team, so they not only have to calm down but come up with a plan, they can go right back to general population or to normal activities without needing any isolation whatsoever, because they're literally pulled into the next room or pulled aside or pulled to another side of the unit. So they don't actually leave the area. We also instituted a staff shadowing program in place of isolation. So if a youth is having difficulty adjusting or getting along with others on a more regular basis, or they have low tolerance for distress, we'll place a staff person by their side for the day. And that staff person's job is to follow the youth to school, to recreation, and to all their programs. And they're trained to help the youth use coping skills to stay out in general population, to continue going to school and programs, so that the student doesn't have to request a timeout or ask for isolation, or the staff will then not have to feel they need to isolate the youth. So rather than isolating a youth, we're engaging the youth more in this case with the staff shadowing. We also felt that we should give students a voice, and so we have a staff student council at each facility so that the youth can help make decisions and make suggestions for improving facility life. They're also tasked with recognizing staff who do a good job of de-escalating or who do show good mentoring skills. So we do try to have the students report out on which staff are doing well so that we can reward those staff. And with all these processes we put in place, the culture has changed quite a bit in Indiana. Our staff report that it's second nature to engage and de-escalate youth who are in crisis rather than isolate them so that everyone can continue with regular activities.
So as with any program or procedure, our culture needs to be reviewed periodically to ensure practices are still effective. Research is constantly being updated regarding programming, methodology, evidence-based programming, cognitive treatment, incentives, effective use of isolation on youth is just mentioned a few of those things that have constantly been changed up. So the youth within our facilities have also changed. As the staff that we discussed, recruitment, we have a multi-generational workforce currently in all of our sites. Therefore, we need to adapt to meet each of those generational needs and our youth needs too. In our division, we are undergoing currently strategic planning regarding our facility procedures and programs. We have developed committees with facility representatives to conduct the review and responsible for developing plans, making recommendations. So we're making sure that the field has a voice in this process. It is not one of those that the central office is the one that's making the decisions and then trickling it down to the field. It's more of a bottom-up method of their kind of having the ideas. They're talking about how they're going to implement it. So there's more of that buy-in when that comes from them because they understand why those decisions were made. They feel like they have root in those decisions being made. As with continuous quality improvement process, identifying the issues and developing a plan to address it. Our facilities are constantly reviewing their incidents with daily monitoring meetings, as we alluded to earlier, and also through monthly metrics. This provides them with the opportunity to quickly recognize any concerns and develop plans to address those issues, not just waiting on some big incident or some big person to come through and say, hey, you need to focus on this issue. They're seeing an increase maybe in isolation or maybe an increase in the use of force, so then they can then address that issue within their department or within their facility and get that under control and get new ideas on how to handle it. So in conclusion with what we talked about as far as changing culture, we just want to make sure that you guys know to take things slowly. We didn't just make all these changes in one foul swoop. We had to address one issue and tackle it and then add on another one. Because if you do too many at a time, your staff will become overwhelmed and won't know what your real mission and focus is. So if you just pick one of these things that maybe Clint, Peter, or Mark or I talked about and focus on that and then add another layer and just kind of keep building on it, your culture will change. So that's all for Indiana. We'll turn it over to Peter now.
Hi, this is Peter Forbes. I'm the commissioner of DYS in Massachusetts. I want to thank Clint, Natalie, and Mark for your presentation, and I want to thank CJCA for stepping up on this. This is a really important issue in juvenile justice. See if I can move the slide. Okay. Two really important compass points and we're all at different places here, but two really important compass points as you approach this work are, from my perspective, it's really about safety. We want to try to separate the punishment door and the safety door, because if you go in the punishment door, it's a very different conversation. That's a separate, it's an important conversation. Accountability is important, but as it relates to, I call it room confinement, as it relates to room confinement, it's really about safety. And the beauty of that conversation is nobody can really push back on the importance of safety and secure programs. The second piece, which is very fundamental in all of our work, is that we want young people to grow, learn, mature, and be better off for their experience with us. And if they're locked in their rooms for misbehavior or for accountability purposes, they're not in school in their seats to get the full benefit of the educational program. They're not in group, they're not in rec, and they're not doing all the other things that are going to help them move forward. So those are two really fundamental messaging points as you enter this conversation. The second piece is when we started this work in Massachusetts, we've been at this for a decade, at least 10 years. And when we started out, we had no policy, we had no practice expectations, and we had no data. So we really couldn't see what was going on in the programs, but we were clearly putting kids in their rooms against their will for a variety of reasons. So the policy development is really a great place to get people on board. And I think Clint said, you don't want to write the policy in a boardroom and then come out and try to force it on the field. The idea is to really include as many people as possible to get them on board as you're developing the policy. And I think Clint and Natalie both said, you're going to have some patience. You're going to have to have some institutional patience in making this change. And getting a policy written is really important, but the process is as important as the substance. So getting people on board and making sure that once you do have a thoughtful policy, that you spend the time getting it out there and that you try to really strategically think about who do you need to talk to, who's going to carry the message, at what level of your agency is this going to get messaged out? Are you just going to email it? That I wouldn't suggest that you do that. This really requires people getting in their cars and driving out to the secure programs and meeting with people at shift change in the facility to talk about the purpose and the why and the implementation plan. And so every jurisdiction will have to, think that through differently, but really take the time to think about how are you going to put the policy together and then what you're going to do about implementing it, because they're equally as important. In Massachusetts, again, which is my point of reference, we wrote the policy and we prohibited the use of involuntary room confinement for the purposes of punishment and sanction. And we did that deliberately. It was a huge step for us. It took us a period of a couple of years to really operationalize that, because every time you turn around, there are questions about how people are going to interpret the policy and then implement it at the program level. So you're going to need a policy, and then you're going to need a serious approach to being able to see what's going on at the program level. So I talked a little bit about data. I think Natalie and Mark talked a little bit about data. When we started this, we had no idea. Today, we get a daily report. We built it from scratch. We actually, when we started to really focus on data and how many kids are in their room and for how long and who put them there and what kind of approval and whether or not it's consistent with the policy, we really built that from scratch. We had every single secure program calling into a call center at the end of the 3 to 11 shift in the evening to register how many kids were in their room and for how long. And then we started to talk to the programs about their use of room confinement in a more meaningful way. We also, I think it was Natalie said, we cross-reference incident reports with the use of room confinement, so that if there is a constellation of room confinement but no incident report, it's, from an operational standpoint, you call and find out, what happened. where's the incident report so I can understand the room confinement. And so over time, we've built this into our management information system, into our MIS system, so that now we get a daily report, and we also get a monthly report that shows where the room confinement is taking place. And it's extremely helpful to have that kind of a report come across basically your desktop, so you can try to figure out what programs, what regions of the state, what kind of programs. We have a monthly report that we get on room confinement, restraint, and a number of other safety indicators. And the one that we received for January, most recently, in the last couple of days, we had a lot of restraints across 4 of our primary detention programs. So that data directs us toward a conversation with those programs about what's going on. And it's not, the conversation is not, you're using too much room confinement, you're a bad program. The conversation is really about, it looks comparatively that you're using a lot of room confinement. Can we talk about what's going on in that program? Is it a leadership issue? Is it a staff shortage issue? You know, do you have a constellation of very difficult young people in the program, et cetera? So the data allows you to be strategic in how you try to improve the system, because it's not just room confinement. It's about staff being assaulted. It's about fights among the kids. It's about any kind of property damage that you track, and then room confinement and restraint. And then we also bundle in things like industrial accident and staff time out of work, all of those safety indicators into one report, so we can really take a look at the health of the program. Hope that makes sense. Collecting baseline data. Sorry about that. So, you know, I use a couple of the PBS slides to show, first of all, PBS is a way of looking at this. I'm not here to sell PBS. We use PBS. But PBS has focused on isolation for years. And it's a way of being able to look at what does the national picture look like, and what do you look like, and then what do you look like over time. And the national average is the upper bar graph, the graph, and then the lower line is Massachusetts, that shows that in our PBS programs, we're using a lot less isolation per 100 days of secure placement. The next slide shows the timing of it, and you know what's happened here in Massachusetts is we've gone and settled a little bit under an hour on average for room confinement, which to me, I think that makes some level of sense in that it takes about that amount of time for a 17-year-old boy to cool off. So 45 minutes to an hour may be appropriate for a young person just to cool off. And then the question becomes, you know, what's next? What are you going to do about that when that young person doesn't need to be locked in their room, but they can move on to another part of the facility for programming? So I just use the PBS slides because they help illustrate a point. One of the prior presenters, I believe it was Clint, talked about DBT. We didn't take DBT on because of room confinement, but we did take DBT on in the same time frame. And it's allowed our staff and our programs to get organized around an approach that helps young people problem solve, self-soothe, and you know, kind of manage themselves in periods of stress and crises. And it's been very good. It's not the absolute solution for all jurisdictions, but it's been a big piece of our clinical platform. And part of what we did in the DBT piece, similar to room confinement, is we got the direct care staff very much involved in it. In Massachusetts, in our programs, everywhere you go, we do DBT. And the modality is that we have a licensed clinical person and a direct care staff that co-facilitate the groups. That has really helped us bring DBT into the life space. some of the other things that we've tried to do, Natalie talked about family. That doesn't reflect in my slides, but we've really tried to get families more involved in our operations and more bought into what we're trying to do with their kids. We've done some of that through the youth in custody practice model that we did with CJCA and CJJR. Positive incentive-based programming is a tough one. It's worth pursuing, and part of the reason it's tough is you have to allow the programs a high level of input in building the system so that they then have the ownership. If you try to drop positive-based incentive programming from the top down, you're going to have a really difficult time getting that integrated. So there has to be a certain amount of ability for the programs at that level to create their own system. And then the challenge with that is you can wind up with different things happening in different parts of your jurisdiction, and whether or not you have the, I don't know, whether or not organizationally that makes sense for you. Another thing that we spent a lot of time on here in Massachusetts was strategies to get young people out of their rooms. So getting them in is, generally seen as the hard part, but then getting them out is as important and in some ways as difficult, because the kid can say, "Hey, I'm all set to go," and all he wants to do is get in the calf so he can punch that kid that he's mad at. So we spent a fair amount of time on that, and we actually, in Massachusetts, we're organized. Our workforce is organized, through a labor union, and we got our union involved in that piece of work, in particular, about how do you decide that a young person is ready to come out of their room and move on, and they don't have to go mainstream right into the TV room with all the other kids. They can go into a more individualized program. I think Mark talked about one-on-one, with the door open, with the young person, with a staff person who's shadowing them. If you have the staffing resources to do that, in a lot of ways, it's better than having them locked in their room for long periods of time. When they come out, they're just not ready to make that shift. And then, obviously getting staff on board, getting your training academy on board. Indiana talked a lot about that. Really trying to, from a cultural standpoint, enforce the fact that from a positive youth development standpoint, young people are assets, that, adolescent brain, that just because a young person looks like he's 25 years old, if he's 17, he's 17, and he's actually very immature and impulsive. We've done a lot of motivational interviews, and we've worked on trying to get staff more energized and more involved and equipped to deal with defiant and acting out behavior, so that it's not, personalized when a young person insults a staff member and you go mano a mano around who's going to be the most stubborn person here, to build staff so that they have more tools to be able to negotiate and navigate that. We also do an annual research for 2 days at our academy. So every person that's in a direct care position, they go back out to the academy for 2 days annually, and we build in a lot of refresher and reinforcement around working with young people and what that's all about, what the context is. So with that, I hope that made sense, and I'm going to hand it back to Mike and Brendan and Sharon back at CJCA.
Well, thank you, Peter, and thank you to all our panelists here today. There's a lot of information, and we've got some good questions that have already come in. Before I get to some of those, I do just want to remind you some things that we mentioned earlier. You can type in your questions here on the webinar control panel, and I'll read those aloud to our panelists. If you've got a particular panelist that you'd like to direct your question towards, just let me know, and I'll make sure I get it directed to them. So type those in now. We'll address some of them. Also, just a reminder that we will send out a copy of the slides for anybody that's looking for them. I had somebody ask about the CJCA Toolkit that Mike had put on the screen earlier. We'll give you a link to that in a follow-up email. And also, I had somebody ask for the policy in Massachusetts that Peter had up on the slide just a few slides ago. And that's available on the Massachusetts DYS website, but we'll include a link to that as well. And if there's anything else that you saw here including we'll do a video recording, but if there's anything else that we could follow up with, just let us know. We'll be sure to do so. So I'll move on to the questions. Remember, you can type them in here on the panel. And the very first one I got was much earlier on. And earlier on, what I got was had to do with turnover. And so this was during Clint's slides, had to do with, you know, you said you've been at it for a long time. And what's all of our panelists today said this was not a quick thing. It took a long time to see these. But how did turnover sort of affect how you approached this? We got a lot of facilities out there that have very high rates of turnover. So maybe just kind of an overview of how turnover played in. And Clint, I'll give it to you, but I want to pass it through all of our panelists. Clint, you there?
Yes. Yeah, turnover is, you know, and I think an issue with most jurisdictions, just the type of work that we do. We have just found that repeating the message and the training opportunities and having, you know, leadership at my level and the superintendent level to consistently meet with teams to continue the message and where we're at working on isolation reduction. We did go to sleep a little bit on it. You know, we did that first big effort roadshow, so to speak, and I had some great results and feedback, and then we got a little lazy and went and started, you know, on other things that around the use of isolation or reducing isolation, and was seeing that kind of issue come up. So just kind of communicate more and more and a consistent message and repetitions, and really empower your local leadership teams to continually address the issue. The other piece would be to, you know, most jurisdictions have a training academy, and having folks continually at the leadership level go present at those training academies is also important.
All right, how about Mark and Natalie? You guys have anything on turnover and how that played into your changes?
Sometimes turnover, I know when we were really working in Indiana as our culture, we expected there to be some turnover, because when you're changing a culture, sometimes those people that don't fit with that direction you're going with are going to leave. So we saw it as an opportunity to get, like Mark said, recruiting the right people with the right mindset to be in those facilities. And yes, it's a struggle still, like Clint was just talking about. You struggle with it because of the work that you're expecting your people to do, and their long days, and it's a difficult population. So, I mean, we just try to focus on, you know, morale and trying to do little things to encourage each other. We have had recently the privilege of getting recruitment and retention specialists. That's a position we've added in the state of Indiana. So they're really looking at each area, because each facility has a different reason why retention or recruitment might be an issue. Maybe it's because it's a rural area. Maybe it's because there's a lot of other opportunities in that area, you know, that have higher paying jobs. So we're really looking at specifically those facilities and looking at what their reasons are for recruitment and retention. So hopefully in the next webinars, we can have some results from them, and we can provide you some kind of strategies that we're going to do in Indiana regarding retention.
Peter, anything to add on that?
I would say, I mean, I think Clint, a combination of what Clint and Natalie said. A, you want to really work hard to keep good people. But B, sometimes attrition can be on something like this, you know, with the shift toward the adolescent brain science, positive youth development, a strong rehabilitative focus, reducing room confinement, really that whole thread. Sometimes attrition can be healthy for the organization, because then you've got new people showing up in your training academy that are going to come through understanding that this is the way that we do business, versus trying to get people on board with a change in business. So I think you have to do both, but attrition and time and patience will also help you get there.
I think those are all great answers to a very hard question to solve around staff turnover. Tell you what, the next question I got was actually during Mark and Natalie. You guys were talking about including data in your daily meetings, and so I want to see if you can take us around or inside some of those meetings. Like, what were the takeaways What were some things that might have been discussed in some of those meetings? Like how do you present this out? And maybe a little bit about how you do it with your managers meetings. Is that different from your regular direct care staff meetings? So maybe elaborate on some of those.
Okay, so with our daily incident monitoring meetings, we have staff that go through all the incident reports that occurred that past 24 hours or over that weekend, and they kind of do include the ones that are higher level, kind of like the assault or anything that will result in isolation or injury. Those kind of things make it to the table for discussion. And so we have, at those meetings, we have custody representatives, we have treatment representatives, we have mental health, warden is there, like all those different positions and all those different departments, education, everybody is present at that table to discuss, like I said, we can talk about, that youth and maybe what things are going on in that youth behavior as far as their treatment, how are they doing in education, those kind of things are discussed. And then we can also look at, is there something we need to change in our process? Do we need to, like Mark was talking about, put that staff shadow on that youth, instead of isolation? So we kind of come up with an individual plan for that youth. And then monthly, we look at their metrics. So their metrics are based off of what the previous year's PBS data was regarding that. So we put in ranges of what would be like a green, a yellow, or a red, kind of. A red would be a situation where you kind of want to start looking at that topic or issue. So if it's isolation duration going up, or is it the number of assaults going up, those kind of things. So we can come together with kind of develop an improvement plan and see what we can do to kind of address those areas. Is it a specific area within the facility that's having an issue? Is it a certain youth that's having an issue? So we kind of break it down into those smaller things that we need to look at and develop a plan based on that information. Hopefully that answered that person's question. If it doesn't, let me know.
I think it's also important that at the incident monitoring meetings, again, it's important to have representatives from all departments there, so that the solution or the solutions you're going to try with the youth, everyone's there who's a player in the game. So it's not just about custody coming up with a solution for this kid that's acting out. Everyone's involved in the solution. Everyone has a piece to support that youth. And the youth knows that, because then the department heads are tasked with going back to so the counselor of that youth is going to get something from the head of treatment about what they need to do. Recreation sometimes even attends these meetings. So they may take the kid out and let him do something if that's helping him reduce the stress. So it's not just people coming up with solutions that all fall on custody. Everyone has a part in the solution, working with that youth.
Well, thank you guys, and hopefully we've answered the question. Let me see, I'm flipping through some more things that we've got here, and another question that I've got is, so we've got various definitions for what room confinement is out there, and we've got that varies from one state to another. So is there any kind of universal definition that you're following? And Mike, actually, I might throw this one over to you, because you had pulled up that toolkit earlier. What would you recommend for somebody that's looking for sort of a universal or uniform confinement definition throughout the U.S.?
Yeah, as I said earlier, CJCA kind of defers to the performance-based standard definition of isolation, which is anytime you are physically separating a youth from the general population, placing him or her into a room or cell for the purpose of punishment, or for some sort of any type of administrative purposes. That's important. If you're putting a youth inside a room or cell outside of their normal sleeping hours, that is being typically considered as a form of isolation.
And we'll make sure we, like I said, we'll include a link to that toolkit, which makes the references to PBS. And I think you'll see some of that. And all three of the panelists today had sort of mentioned their PBS data, which needs to be collected uniformly in order to be able to make those comparisons. So that's definitely a recommendation we'd go with there. So I've got a question about how to judge when a youth is ready to come out of their room. So we had that on the DYS policy. So maybe, Peter, I'll start with you on this. So how do you go about making that determination that they're ready to come out and ready to rejoin the population? Who makes that determination? what are some things you do while they're in their room to get them ready to come out? So Peter, could you talk about that for a little bit?
Yeah, I don't know that it's an exact science. I think it comes down to in some programs, particularly in our committed programs, you get a much better handle on getting to know the young person. That's a fundamental staple in the business, is you get to know the young person that you're dealing with. And if you're able to do that, you're able to make a much better judgment on whether or not they're actually calmed down. It's much harder to do that in a detention program where the transaction is a lot quicker and you don't have that young person as long. But you have to talk to them. You have to go in the room and you have to talk to them. And we had this long debate about if Brendan puts the young person in their room, then Peter should take him out. And we've gone back and forth and actually amended our policy to allow for Brendan to be able to be the one potentially to go back in and get him out. It's really situational. And, I think that, to the extent that you have clinical staff in the building and you can enlist them to either consult or potentially go in and talk to a particularly disturbed young person. I mean, we have some really disturbed kids across the country that are, in this equation. And it's not really easy for, your line worker to make that determination that the young person is ready to come out. But they have to be calm. They have to be able to answer some questions. And then if you're not sure, you have to have an interim strategy that may include some one-on-one work or sometime in another part of the program where all the other kids aren't. And some of that is really staffing driven. If you don't have the ability to peel a staff person off, it's very difficult. So I think it's very situational. You have to go in and periodically check on them. A good policy will say that. And then at some point you make the determination, hey, I'm going to crack his door and I'm going to let him come out. And maybe he sits in the chair in the hall for a half hour, or maybe he does an exercise. We have a repair system where young people are, required to write or, to maybe clean a piece of the program, or in some ways demonstrate that they're actually on board. And a lot of times we use that repair system as a way of bringing them back into the program.
I would agree there's no magic formula for that, so it's definitely a case-by-case basis. Let me get the next question back to our friends in Indiana, and I've got a couple people have commented on they really enjoyed seeing some of the family engagement, the family involvement, and how you'd stepped that up. But one of the things you mentioned was incorporating a family council. So I had a question about that and sort of what that looked like, what was involved on that family council.
Okay, a family council. So each facility is tasked with developing a family council. So part of the issue is getting families to participate. So when we talk to the families during treatment teams or whenever we do our initial conversations, whatever we do, we talk to them about this family council and talk to them about how they can participate in looking at what we do in our facilities. They can talk about, improvements, things that they have concerns, maybe that we can respond. Some of it was, I know they looked at the letters that go out to the families when the kid is transferred into the treatment facilities. So they were not getting all the information that they wanted. So part of the council talked about what information they wanted and what they wanted that to look like. And so that was one of the things that came about from a family council meeting. Typically, it's our warden or a deputy warden. Sometimes it's a program director, but we have someone from the executive team meet with that council on at least a monthly basis. And sometimes with youth leaving and coming, those members will change. But some of the times, the parents are our best recruiters. We had one parent that was always recruiting people during visitation while they were waiting for their youth to show up, saying, you really need to participate in this council because you can, impact what happens with your son while he's here. And so we had a really good conversation, and those things can be formal as far as sitting down in the visitation room, or they could just be an informal kind of call to the warden at that point.
Thank you. So the next question I think I can throw across all three, and Clint, I haven't talked to you in a little bit, so why don't I start with you? But I've got a question about holding youth accountable, and that's that's always a tough one to answer here, but when you've got that one youth or, small percentage of your youth that are just constantly disrupting the population, they're acting out a lot, they're very assaultive, how is it that you deal with them, but also accountability and sort of that perception of the rest of the youth around them, that's unacceptable behavior. So maybe talk about some things that might be how you hold them accountable without confinement.
Yeah, that's kind of the magic bullet during this culture change, is folks really seeing a lack of converting or interpreting what we're doing in reducing isolation as an inability to hold youth accountable. And it's really going back to that argument and understanding that isolation is a safety intervention. It's not a consequence. It's not punitive. It's not a sanction. And really making that clear, having a clear separation that this is just not part of punishment. And then trying to create the new paradigm that, what accountability actually is, right? I think there's a slide that talked about redefining reformation and accountability and making sure that that's clear. Accountability and how we really message that with our folks is we're trying to enhance internal accountability in youth, give them the skills in order to be able to hold themselves, learn from their mistakes and hold themselves accountable, because that's really the only way they're going to create safety in the community. And so, and knowing that isolation is not a place where you can develop skills at all, really, especially with the clientele that have a high use of isolation. These are kids with IEPs, right? They're anywhere from 15 to 17 or younger. They have mental health diagnosis. These are vulnerable populations or trauma history that we know this extended isolation is absolutely hurtful and counterproductive to building skill, which actually makes accountability happen. So probably those two things is the best way, I believe, in trying to restructure what accountability is. There's still plenty of things we have to develop to hold youth accountable as far as consequences. Isolation just isn't one of them.
Anybody else want to add anything there? Either Natalie and Mark or Peter, you guys?
We had the same issue. In fact, I think this is probably one of the last things we've been changing and working on, is moving from staff understanding just the purpose of isolation, but then that holdout always was the punishment angle. So we want to, kid did something and we want to lock him up for X number of hours. So that's probably been the toughest thing to change in the culture. And the way that we've gone about it is by making isolation more about separation, that it's all about calming a youth down and getting them back into general population as soon as possible. We again redefined what we meant by that. And so now we've moved towards, one of the last things we worked on was changing our code of conduct and removing any type of isolation as a sanction. And so it becomes, again, the job of isolation is not to be a sanction. So that doesn't mean we remove the other sanctions. So there's plenty of other sanctions in place. And I think what happens is with a youth, I mean, one of the first ways of doing accountability is we have those youth development specialists participating in treatment teams, talking to treatment staff. So it becomes a team decision about how to address the youth and what that will look like on the unit. So it can involve interventions. It can involve tying those interventions to goals, monthly or bi-weekly goals that the youth has, so that improving that behavior becomes part of their treatment plan. If it gets to the point where a youth has chronic issues with wanting isolation, we then move that up to our Making a Change program. So we actually program the youth differently. We put them in more intensive programming. It tends to be a combination of dialectical behavior therapy, along with some aggression replacement training, some ART. And so we're going to put those youth in more programs. And we tend to look at it based on where is the behavior coming from. Is the source more about, say, something like distress tolerance, which might be a mental health issue, So then we're erring towards bringing in our mental health professionals and putting that youth into DBT. So we're going to give that youth more programming. And again, that will impact their time. So the youth see it as, now I have to do more time to get this program done. So the youth see it as accountability. Not how we view it. We want to give them more interventions to help them out, versus a youth who it's more anti-social attitudes and values, and that might be more of the ART, or we use more recognition therapy. We might move them into that sort of program. And we also have what we kind of call spot DBT, where a kid who's having issues might be brought in with their counselor, case manager, and the mental health staff to talk about certain skills that might help them right now. So we kind of do that as a spot DBT. And so, over time, the youth that are engaging in these behaviors, if we tie it to their treatment plans, those youth stay longer, and they see that as, that's holding me accountable. So what you're saying is, if I continue with these behaviors, I don't get released when I think I'm getting released, and that does improve the behavior of some youth.
Great. And just because you mentioned DBT a couple times, somebody did ask about elaborating on DBT. That might be for a larger webinar or a harder thing to elaborate on quickly, but I will try and follow up with you directly and see if there's some resources that we can give you in regards to DBT. And actually, Peter, did you want to weigh in at all on the accountability piece?
I'm afraid if I get started, I'll eat up the rest of the webinar, but that really is something that you have to put some thought into. We have a repair system that really addresses, a lot of the lower defiance, some of the lower level acting out, attitudinal, failure to follow directions, things like that, where you can, give a young person a task that makes sense there. We also have a policy called individual support plans, where you have a young person who just can't regulate themselves and they're bouncing off the walls and creating problems in the program. And the individual support plan requires us to get the parent involved and the young person involved in trying to problem solve a more structured kind of check-in system and supervision system in the program, so that they get positive and negative reinforcement. I think that, the old style program of you wake up with 100 points and then you lose points all day for everything that you don't do right, that becomes really toxic for some kids. Other young people, they gravitate toward that and they excel, but it's the kids that don't, that you really have to have. It's like one size does not fit all. You have to have the ability to do some individualized work with young kids, and you have to have some sense of order in the program. The really difficult piece is the kid that, punches a staff person. And, what does that then look like? Someone that really goes over the top. And I think the people that are on this webinar that are trying to figure out things back home, you're going to confront that, or certainly staff are going to confront you with that. And you have to have a response, and we do. We have a protocol for that. It's very detailed. I think we can share that with CJCA and the people that are on this call. It talks about in the event that were to happen, and we will use levers like their time assignment, reassigning to different programs on the committed side. We have a program that's designed for kids that have been violent in other parts of the system. It's a small, not a punishment program. It's a small individualized program in the western part of the state that we send kids for periods of time. But I think the jurisdictions are going to have to really think that one through and make sure that you have, multiple tiers for nuisance type behavior, and then for real serious type behavior. How do you respond to that to keep people? Again, it's about safety and really trying to make sure that the kids and the staff are safe in the program environment.
And I'm glad you answered it that way, because there were actually a couple questions about some individualized program that you had mentioned on earlier slides. So I think you addressed some of that. Two birds with one stone in that answer. Appreciate that. Back to Indiana, because I got a question about the care team and sort of who's made up on that care team. What is it made up of? Does it include, education or mental health? Is it direct care? administrator? Who's on the care team when they respond?
Okay, so the care team varies by facility, depending on size of facility and availability of staff. We actually make mental health staff are not part of care team, because what we found in the past was that any kind of failure to comply suddenly became a mental health issue. And so that's actually a step up from care team, is calling mental health to intervene. The care team will evaluate that if mental health intercession is necessary. So what we wanted to do was to make it where on care teams, we typically have officers can be on it, our youth, our YDSs. We can have treatment staff who are on it, education staff can be on it, and admin staff. As long as you go through the training to get the care team skills, you can be on it. And we try to vary the team's membership. We have a schedule at each facility so that when it's called, you know when you're on for care team. So it can be everybody from a program director over to even if a secretary was interested and wanted to go through care team training and they showed some skills, or because a lot of our staff are mentors too. So a lot of our mentors end up on care teams. But again, it's everybody except for mental health staff. We want that to be the next level. So we don't want mental health staff called for every single conflict in the building.
And the big thing is we do, like Mark said, assign staff to it. But if you're in the area when a care team is being called, correct, and you've been trained, you can say, like Walker responding to that correct situation, so that the other people can stand down for a little bit and you can address that situation. So just because you're not on that care team that day doesn't mean you can't respond to the call if you're in that area and help diffuse the situation. Because what the whole thing is, there's a situation that's kind of escalating, so we need to get it diffused as soon as possible. So if you're in the area and you can handle it, go ahead and tap in and let those other people tap out to address something else.
Same thing happens if, for example, a care team member is a YDS and it's and the student's having an issue with you, we can call in other people. So that's right. So for example, if I'm scheduled to be on care team, but I've got a youth in my office on the phone with their family, typically I can radio for someone else and someone else on the care team can go. But as Natalie said, a lot of people will just respond because they've had the training.
That kind of segues into one of the other questions, which is, so you mentioned, depending on how many staff you have there, or what the staff ratios are like, and Peter, you had mentioned a little bit about staff ratios, but what do you have for tips for people that have inadequate staffing, those that are short-staffed, and how do they do some of these things when they don't have the ability to build a team like that? And that's a tough question to answer too, and I'm not quite sure if anybody would be better poised to answer that, but Clint, can I start with you? Do you have any advice for somebody who might be inadequately staffed?
Find some money. Yeah.
Told you it's a tough one.
Yeah. It is tough. Our structure is 25 youth and 3 staff, which, and we're breaking those staff a lot. So a lot of times it's just 2 staff members with 25 youth. Super challenging if you don't have a third-party resource to come in and deal with, issues that are getting out of hand. I would say where resources are low, what tends to happen is your staff will end up pulling back and posting up to kind of ensure that, the lid doesn't pop off the place. You have to fight that, and you have to get your staff, even the 2 and 3 staff with that big group of youth, to really kind of divide and conquer and engage with those youth on a consistent basis. Make sure that there is a busy schedule, all the basic things to prevent those type of crises that happen on a regular basis. And when they do happen, hopefully the relationships that are built with those staff are really what is able to de-escalate, and lean on, like I heard some things earlier about administrative staff or clinical staff assisting. It is kind of all hands on deck, depending on size of your facility, and so you have to look outside of the general direct care staff to assist in the process.
For Indiana, I would say a couple different things. And we run into this. My office, even though I'm central office, my office is up at the LaPorte facility, which is the smallest juvenile facility we have. And so that it can become even a stretch there. Number one is, I think you have to teach your staff what is a care team call, and we still struggle with that at times. So, for example, a youth walking into, we have to kind of adjust how you talk to how staff address things. So we had a youth who came into a classroom, didn't want to sit down. So that teacher, every single day, every time she had that student, it was a care team call. That's really not a good use of resources. So we eventually, we actually brought that kid up, talked about it. He's allowed, he can walk in, and for the first, he's got 30 minutes to an hour. In the morning, the mentors meet with him when he comes to her class, and he can stand there for a few minutes and then sit down. It's not really a care team issue. So you have to be very specific about what rises to the level of care team, and making sure that if you're short-staffed, that those line staff have as many de-escalation tools in their belt that they can. And then I agree. The other thing is, the smaller your facility, the more supervisors have to get involved. And so at what is now the girls' facility, it's quite frankly, it's the program director, the principal, and the assistant warden are usually the three that are care team if they have to be. And they know that, and they want to show that support to their line staff, to the YDSs. So they typically are going to care team as well. And so that's the solution they've come up with up there.
Well, we're actually running out of time here, so I'm going to stop with the questions right there, although I will mention there's one question in here about looking for, what are some positive incentives, or what are some other alternatives that you have for isolation and room confinement? And although we didn't address too many of those today, we will address some of those on our next webinar, which will be on alternatives to room confinement. So we'll be sure to send all the follow-up information, like I said, all the attachments and all that in follow-up emails. But we'll also tell you when the next webinar is and how to register for that as well. So we're expecting that, I believe, in the, Sharon, I'm going to get it wrong. Maybe I'll ask you in just a minute here. But there will be an upcoming webinar on the alternatives for isolation and room confinement. So keep your eye out for the registration for that. And with that, that brings us to just about the end. So Mike, why don't you take us home here?
All right. Thanks, everyone. Let me see if I can pull all this together for us and try to close this out here relatively quickly. I think what we have to keep in mind is that this is a very difficult process to undertake. And as you probably realize now from hearing everybody talk, culture change is a high priority involved in this process, in the process of reducing isolation. Changing culture is a difficult process that requires intense communication and contact with your direct care staff, and it takes time. It's a long-term commitment. We have to keep in mind that as you go through this process, fear for safety, staff safety is a priority, and it is a real fear. It's a real concern of particularly the line staff as you're making these changes. And keep in mind that those fears are real. We have historically taught our staff to respond to these types of behaviors through the use of force, through the use of isolation, through the use of restraint. And as we pull those tools away from them, we have to find ways to give them other skills and teach them other ways to interact with the kids and respond to those behaviors. So yeah, absolutely have to keep in mind the fear for safety issue of those staff, and recognize that those fears are real, and spend the time with them to help them understand that these changes will actually result in safer atmospheres, safer climate, and safer conditions for the staff and for the kids. Many jurisdictions have been through this process, and this has been proven out time and time again. A final thought on the care teams is to keep in mind that those care teams have been successfully used in many jurisdictions now, and they've been very successful in helping to reduce the isolation placements of youth. And going back to the question Brendan asked, you'll have a lot, you're going to have a response to these behaviors. Many facilities have emergency response teams. Care teams can be used in a similar way. One of the things that we found in Indiana as a result of the care teams is that when the care teams were responding, the kids automatically started to de-escalate themselves because they knew that the care team was coming and was going to help them de-escalate and find alternatives to their behavior. Whereas in the cases of emergency response teams, the kids' behavior actually escalates because they know that the emergency response team is essentially coming to fight. So a complete difference in philosophies between the two teams. So that's something to give some consideration to as well. So in March of 2015, CJCA published a toolkit on reducing the use of isolation that we've talked about several times. The toolkit is essentially establishes 5 steps to effectively reducing isolation. You need to establish a rehabilitative mission statement and philosophy, develop restrictive isolation policies and procedures, utilize data to drive your practices, develop alternative behavioral management tools, and provide staff training and support. Again, the staff training is critical as you go through this process. You have to absolutely provide them with other skills and teach them other ways to respond to the behaviors of the youth. There is the CJCA website, cjca.net. The CJCA Toolkit is available on the website under publications or resources. Publications. And we have a couple of other additional resources there on the screen. In addition to CJCA, we also have the Center for Juvenile Justice Reform at Georgetown. Their website is there. The final one is, I would direct you all to the Stop Solitary for Kids campaign. You can view their website at stopsolitaryforkids.org. SSK has developed a room confinement assessment tool called their RCAT and a facility survey, which might be useful to you all as well. SSK would like to connect with sites interested in either field testing the RCAT or those who are willing to share their success stories. If you're interested, you can contact Jennifer Lutz, who is the campaign manager for the Center for Juvenile Justice or Center for Children's Law and Policy, and her email is jlutz@cclp.org. I think it's on the next slide. No, it's not. Okay. So again, I want to thank each of our presenters, Peter, Clint, Natalie, and Mark. Again, great job, and thank you very much for taking the time out of your busy days to provide these resources to the field. I want to thank everyone for your commitment and dedication to this project, and more importantly, thank everyone for your commitment to improving the conditions of confinement and the outcomes for all the youth who are entrusted to our care. Please keep in mind that we are all available to you throughout this project. Other jurisdictions have already gone through this work, and they have resources available to you as well that we can pull together for you if you need to. So feel free to reach out to any of us at any time should you need. And I want to thank Brendan and our CJCA PBS partners for assisting on this project, and thank Sharon Pett as well, who will be working more closely with you all as the project moves forward.
Well, thank you, Mike, and everybody have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.